All right, this is awkward. I appreciate all of you joining me today. We're gonna focus on mutual aid as it relates to a movement of working and poor people across political spectrums, and as it relates to the threat or reality of a general strike. For those that may have missed it or who uh, would like a recap. Our last meeting was a couple or a few weeks ago. We had Sarah Nelson as our special guest. She's the head of the flight attendants union and is, a major figure in the union worker solidarity world, so to speak, in this country. She travels all over the place, helping with strikes and the labor movement in general. She's a national figure and had some really interesting things to say. I would say that, the highlights being that, one, we don't necessarily need to general strike. We need to convince the people in power that we would and can successfully general strike, because in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to put ourselves through that. In order to make that convincing, we need to first determine what the problem is. And that could include things like lack of access to quality healthcare, to safe housing, to a living wage, things like that, that cut across, race and the variety and geography, but certainly not class, and are unique to poor and working people and many millions of us. The next step would be, once we've identified the problem, identifying the solutions to those problems and what our demands would be, and having a small set of concrete achievable demands that are general, universal enough that we would get the widespread support is a big part of that. And that could include Medicare for all, laws for a living wage, you know, maternity, paternity, et cetera, leave, worker ownership, a certain percentage of ownership of all businesses, canceling of student debt or medical debt. These are examples. The next part would be determining how far we're willing to go, agreeing, if we're willing to general strike, and if we are, how long we're willing to general strike, and what that would entail, what it would mean if we did a general strike. And the last two parts, making sure that we are able to actually achieve that. And the two biggest parts of that would be, one, making sure we have the support, both from our fellow poor people, working people, et cetera, that we would actually have enough of a population doing this, that it would be influential. And the other part of that being the support from the media, and, not focusing on our tactics or our strategy or, the people leading it, but on the demands themselves and why they're necessary and why they need to be met. And the last part kind of leads us to what we're going to talk about today, and that is having the infrastructure to be able to do this successfully for an extended period of time, if necessary. There are tons of mutual aid groups all over the country that work locally. It is not just it is very different from philanthropy. Hold on one second, Thomas. It's very different from philanthropy or charity. It is not just money. It is goods, resources, services, etc. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is like learning from the local groups and how we can and learning also, which Faye is going to begin with, learning from the theory and the history of mutual aid, what works and what doesn't, and how we can then build somewhat of a network that is, not hierarchical, that is not top down, that is not formalized in the sense that, there's one organization that is then dictating to all these local groups that are doing what works for their communities, but a way for us to share resources, ideas, and make sure that we across the country can support each other if necessary, so that we could successfully general strike if it came to that. So I'm gonna look at. Oh, okay. So there's a question on the intro. I'm gonna have Thomas ask that question, and then unless there's any other questions after Thomas's about what I've said, but this was just meant to be an introduction. Faye will be speaking first. She is like the head of mutual aid at the Socialist Rifle Association, and I'm really excited to hear what she has to say about history, theory, and also what they're doing over there. But Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Awkward. Just hi, I'm Thomas. You've seen me on the list. The word "we" in your
Okay, great. So I'm
introduction.
gonna reach out to Martina, see if I can catch her before she leaves today. Ask if she has certain preferences for this day.
Is somebody else talking?
Yeah. Can someone, whoever that is, please mute?
That may be Michael. The word "we," are we willing to general strike? And then if so, can we get most people to go along? I just want to make it clear for all of us that we, meaning the group here or some enlargement of the group here, can't general strike by definition. A general strike by definition means a very big we, or it's not a general strike. So that kind of confusion, I think we just need to be clear about that all the way through. If it's not a general strike, it's not anything other than something that we've decided to do for the hell of it or to give it a shot, but it's not a general strike, it's something else.
Totally.
And I'm very focused on general strike, which means by definition, we've got to get a big we involved before it can happen. That's all I wanted to say.
100% true. You and I, Thomas, and some others have learned from experience that, making calls for a general strike as a group of five could only be detrimental. It certainly doesn't work. It certainly isn't a general strike. And for the purposes of, one group can snowball into many groups. And yes, like, I apologize about my cat. I'll be muting myself soon. We are a group of concerned citizens at this point, and virtually nothing more. We've all committed ourselves to this effort, like putting our time and energy into this, but we don't necessarily know what this is yet, which is like why we're having these initial conversations. And what a lot of us as individuals can do as we continue on is bring these lessons we're learning all together to our to our offices or to our factories or wherever we work, as well as to our mutual aid groups where we live. But yes, indeed, when we talk about the we in the sense of a general strike, we're talking we as in the entirety of the working class, essentially, and on behalf of those who are unemployed. We're talking millions of people probably, or it's not going to be successful. So hopefully there's meetings like this happening elsewhere among other people, and the more we communicate our thoughts, the bigger this group grows and the more connections we make. And I do think that mutual aid is a really great way to start making those connections, as we'll learn later, throughout this meeting too, when it comes to the work that Francis is doing and that Myco Mutual is doing. There's efforts underway to connect us, whether online or off. And thank you. This cat is pretty cute. Faye, are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Faye Ecklar. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the director of mutual aid for the Socialist Rifle Association. Before that, I was the vice president of the group and started our push for disaster relief and mutual aid efforts. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the theory and the history behind mutual aid, what it actually means, because I do find that there are a lot of people who have misconceptions about what mutual aid is, or confusions about what the term actually means. So uh, being an anarcho-communist, for me, the best place to start, of course, would be with Peter Kropotkin, who in 1902 published a book called Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution. Um, Now, Kropotkin was not the first person to use the word mutual aid. He didn't invent the term. It was used for decades before him, but he was the first person to really analyze it from a left-wing naturalist perspective, starting with a scientific observation, building into sociological observation, and then making arguments about how our society should function from those observations. So uh, Kropotkin doesn't actually define mutual aid very succinctly within the book. He alludes to its meaning in many ways. He has a couple 2-3 paragraph definitions that aren't very helpful in a call like this. But generally, mutual aid is the impulse among people and even among animals to help each other out of altruism. It's an impulse towards helping without the expectation of a return. And Kropotkin's argument within mutual aid, a factor of evolution, is in response to the social Darwinism that was very prevalent at the turn of the century. Social Darwinism being the sort of reactionary perversion of evolutionary theory, taking Charles Darwin's work and running with phrases like survival of the fittest to argue that the strong have the right to take from the weak, that that people shouldn't have any strong affiliation with someone who isn't a member of their family, a mate or progeny or whatever language there, or saying that people should be subservient to the nation that they are a part of, and this was used to justify capitalism, industrialism, and colonialism, genocide of native peoples and people in Africa and Asia. It was used to justify all the horrors. It was sort of the new atheism of the turn of the century. So what Kropotkin did in his book is he went through, starting with observations from himself and other naturalists, observing animals in the wild and seeing how animals do compete with each other, both within and between species, but also there's a great deal of cooperation. There's a great deal of symbiosis between species. There's a great deal of cooperation within species. If you've ever seen a herd of animals, a herd of deer, a herd of cows, a herd of horses, this is a group of individuals, not all of whom are related by blood, who are working together without an expectation of immediate reward to help one another to survive. There's no market transactions among white-tailed deer, right? From there, he looks at indigenous cultures. It's worth noting that Kropotkin is better than many of his contemporaries, but he still had a condescending view of a lot of indigenous peoples. So don't put him on a pedestal or anything, but he did look at indigenous cultures and see how these often pre-industrial, non-capitalist societies were able to function through people willingly helping one another to overcome the difficulties in their life in order to, overcome hardship, but again, without an expectation of immediate return. And from there, he looked at the history of medieval Europe, Renaissance, through to his modern day of the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And his conclusion was essentially that mutual aid and cooperation is just as important for the success of a species, for the success of a group, for the success of an individual, as competition and warfare is, if not more so. And that he essentially used this to argue that it is perfectly possible and desirable for humanity to move past capitalism and create social and political and economic structures. For instance, the anarcho-communist structures that he proposed that don't rely on markets and debt and exchange, but simply work on the mutual aid impulse, on altruism, on working together. Yes, and that's Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. An excellent book. Like I said, it's mostly scientific observation and sociological observation. The ending is where a lot of the philosophy and political theory of it comes in. It doesn't lay out a actual political program because it's more of a debunking of social Darwinism, but it is, it's a very good book. I'd recommend it. So, like I said, mutual aid was not invented by Kropotkin. The term predates him by a long way. I'm going to put a link to a Jacobin article here in the chat with a good history of mutual aid societies. I won't go too much into detail on this, but essentially there were what were called mutual aid societies or fraternal societies, where people would come together into this organization. They would pay dues to this organization. Typical amount was 1 or 2 days wages per year, and then that organization would spend that money on pensions for the elderly, on helping members whose families were sick, helping essentially people would pool their funds together, and then they'd be shared out to those who are in the most need. And that these organizations were often run democratically, and these existed well, they've existed in some form or another since in Europe, since at least the medieval era, but actual mutual aid societies within an industrial capitalist context are documented at least since the 1860s, if not earlier. And these often intersected with and were very important to the success of the early labor movement, because essentially if all the workers at a given mine or factory were members of this mutual aid society, and they decided to go on strike, which again, 19th century, highly illegal, very good odds of simply being beaten or shot for going on strike. If they chose to go on strike, the mutual aid society could vote to spend resources to support their families, to support the workers themselves, to help them get through the strike without income, to help them deal with the attacks from the state. And so you had this this mutual aid society supporting labor movement strikes. And as we get into the beginning of the 20th century, as the labor movement really takes form and begins winning battles and securing rights for workers above just single shop floor level, but getting industry-wide results, that's when we start seeing unions themselves incorporating mutual aid systems. A strike fund is essentially a mutual aid bank. It's, if we're going to go on strike, we know that our members are not going to, our workers are not going to have the money to necessarily support themselves because they're not going to have any income. So we save up money for years and years, and when we finally go on strike, we can put out money to support anyone who needs it, and go beyond just simple rations. But if there are emergency expenses, we can cover those as well. And so these strike funds, mutual aid organizations were all extremely critical to the success of the early labor movement in helping people get through strikes and actually win their battles. And there were also all sorts of autonomous mutual aid actions and groups that didn't call themselves that, because that wasn't the popularized term that it's become today. But there were all sorts of autonomous groups throughout history, both political, socialist, anarchist, and non-political, who've formed to help out striking workers or any other group that was fighting for liberation. It's always been an extremely important part of any liberatory or revolutionary movement. If you're going to be fighting against an existing economic and political system, you need to have a means to support yourself and support each other during that process. So I would say that if we're thinking about a general strike, fundamentally, mutual aid is absolutely critical. It's not sufficient on its own to attack capitalism, but it is an important component of building a movement that can challenge our current system. So what happens to these mutual aid societies? Why don't we really hear about them so much anymore? Well, what happened was the New Deal and the Great Depression. And what happened was that a lot of mutual aid societies simply, when there was a Great Depression, when a plurality of people are out of work, these mutual aid societies simply didn't have enough money to help everyone, and many of them went bankrupt. The ones that did survive were often the very largest ones with ties to unions or to large fraternal organizations, and those stuck around for quite a while, even after World War II for a bit. But the New Deal sort of took the responsibility of mutual aid for caring for each other. It sort of took that out of the hands of everyone and put that responsibility on the shoulders of the government, which could be a good or bad thing in a vacuum. And I think that the New Deal was a good and important thing overall. But what happened was the responsibility for caring for your neighbors was taken out of people's hands and was placed in the hands of the state. When those New Deal protections and later the Great Society protections started being stripped away through the Reagan era and later on, it's sort of left a vacuum where people expect the state to care for them, but the state is unwilling to do so without onerous restrictions. Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, what sort of stepped up to fill that role were churches. And churches have always done mutual aid work, charity work, whatever you want to call it. They've always done that sort of work to help people. But well, for starters, there is a very strong religious message being pushed alongside with that. And what we've seen over the past several decades is as religiosity in America declines over time, what we see is that the sort of mainline Protestant denominations have sort of emptied out and shrunk quite a bit, and that the more radical, conservative, evangelical, heavily politicized churches have grown. And they are still, especially in rural areas, the main groups that are actually doing mutual aid work and providing for others who are in need. And that is tied to now very often a reactionary political and religious message, which means that if we as the left want to, do mutual aid work for everyone, we have to sort of compete with these conservative churches, which I'm still doing research on how we should pursue these things in rural areas. I've got a few comrades who do live out in the sticks. So that's sort of an area of active research. But in cities, especially, a lot of mutual aid work is done by charity, and a lot of charities have problems and don't do a very good job of it. So there's a lot of space for leftists to come in and organize under that. So yeah, so why should leftists and the labor movement engage in mutual aid in an organized fashion? Well, like, what is the benefit of doing mutual aid? I've already covered some of this, but well, mutual aid can be done in support of more radical actions, whether that's strikes, whether that's protests. If you look at Portland last year, the huge number of mutual aid groups who did so much good work, in support of protests there. You had the car mechanic block, you had the snack block, the snack van, you had all these great groups. There was a lot of that in Minneapolis and in all kinds of cities. It was most strongly evident in Portland. Jail support is a form of mutual aid, which is very important. Another thing that mutual aid helps the left with is it can help leftists who may not have a strong working class background, who are maybe downwardly mobile, which describes a great many people in our society today, to help them understand the situations that people in poverty are experiencing. It's a great way to build understanding and solidarity across classes. Mutual aid work serves as a great training ground for inexperienced organizers. It's relatively low risk, it's highly beneficial, and it's a great way to get an introduction to organizing for people who are new to it. A bit more cynically, it's good PR. Like, if all you do is if all your group does is show up to protests, then people will think that that's all you care about. If you actually do good work helping people who are in need, then that shows that you actually do care about people. You're not just pushing an agenda that people might otherwise be able to dismiss you. And finally, it's the right thing to do. So how are we on time? I've got some stuff here I've written about criticisms and misconceptions of mutual aid, but if we're short on time, I can pass that off.
Yeah, I think we could probably do a second call, or if people have questions about that specifically, we could come back to you. But I definitely want to make sure we talk about like work that's being done today, as well as like how we can join forces, so to speak, nationally.
Great. So just to wrap my end up then, so what we're doing at the Socialist Rifle Association, So my vision of things is that mutual aid is done best when it's done on a local level, autonomously, organized by people within a community who knows what that community needs. You don't want to be a bunch of outsiders showing up, throwing things at the wall and hoping that someone's grateful for it. That's not really mutual aid. So what the program that we're developing is, we're working on having logistics and infrastructure. So for instance, we have a volunteer with a trailer in Georgia who is in a position where if there's a hurricane, he can load up that trailer with a bunch of supplies that we know people need during hurricanes, and can drive to anywhere on the East Coast or the eastern part of the Gulf within 12 hours and meet up with local mutual aid groups to distribute that out, including whether that's SRA chapter or another organization. We're working on our water trailer project in Dallas, where we're raising money to purchase a set of water trailers and water purification systems, so that if there is a community that has had its water supply disrupted, they can show up there and have this, major critical piece of infrastructure to support them, that can also then serve as a base for organizing other mutual aid projects around it. There are other groups that are working along similar lines. I've been in touch with Distribute Aid, which is a European group, which has done great work in Europe. They've gone to the point of doing essentially container level logistics, shipping containerfuls of supplies, getting stuff from nonprofit corporations and sort of laundering it down to more radical groups. A lot of great work there. They're coming to the US. I hope that they can do a lot of good work. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that organizations should focus on building the infrastructure, logistics, and fundraising, and then the actual work on the ground needs to be done locally by autonomous or relatively autonomous groups. And so that's the angle that I'm pushing in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really informative. And I think right in line with what most of us are thinking too. Having the local groups manage their local communities, knowing what they need, but having these larger groups do the logistics, infrastructure, and fundraising. That's really great. We'll save questions for the end just so we can make sure we get through everyone. Francis, are you on?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. You ready to rock?
I sure am.
All right, go for it.
Hi. So I work on 3 different projects, and on the smallest level, the project is the Unbroken Circle Ranch. The organization that works on that is Unbroken Circle. Unbroken Circle Ranch is a project where we hope to provide sustainable living for 10 to 20 people on a 5-acre property in an egalitarian consensus environment. The goal actually is to use that property and have its main goal be, 1, local mutual aid, but also 2, to be able to take in refugees, aiming for short periods of time of 100 or 200 people. Obviously not in great conditions, but it's a refugee project. So, but the primary goal is to get the 10 to 20 people sheltered. We're aiming to give those spaces to people who are housing insecure, who are coming in from abuse they need to get away from, give them a safe, supportive environment to thrive in. And then that project can aid elsewhere. Unbroken Circle will then go on to build more of these and show people how to build them, because we want people to copy our model. We can get 10 to 20 people set up in a sustainable homestead for about $100,000. It comes to 20 people, $5,000 a person, which is amazing. And so we want people to steal our idea, and we want people to run with it and make it better. That's on the smallest scale. Then from up from that, we have the Federation of Free Socialist Collectives, which is a group which aims to network these sorts of egalitarian collectives in a layered, non-hierarchical structure where they mutually support one another, whether with the product of their labor or with excess funding that they earn through remote work, or even just provide alternative housing. If one of them is full and can't take any more people, they have another one that they can send somebody who's in need of housing to. In coordination with that, we have a project called Mass Mutual Aid Network. And Mass Mutual Aid Network is effectively a way for mutual aid groups to combine their resources to provide mutual aid to mutual aid groups. So if one organization has a surplus of water tanks on trailers, they can say to the mutual aid network, we have these water tanks available. Where do they need to go this week? And that can expand into, we have pallets of rice that we don't have a purpose for. Who needs rice? That sort of thing. And then it can also include funding. So those are the three projects. The reason that I think these projects are important is because we're talking about, as Thomas mentioned earlier, we're talking about a goal of a general strike that really does have to include millions of people. And those millions of people might absolutely be willing to get on board with a general strike if they know they have a home, if they know they have food, if they know they have transportation available to them. And when we have these collectives going and the ability to take in refugees from somewhere, then we can absolutely say, if worst comes to worst, and everything to hell in a handbasket, we have a place for you. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. The main method that we operate under is a consensus model, and that consensus model uses proposals that anybody can make, which are then line item processed by everybody involved. We try to keep the consensus councils to about 20 people or less, just because of the detail that they get into. However, what we have found is that doing this process, you get about a 94% consensus rate on every proposal that comes forward, meaning that every person's opposition to it is heard and addressed and resolved in the process of going through the process. That is the model that we want to extend to a network of mutual aid, where we have different mutual aid groups in, say, St. Louis, for example. If there are 10 different mutual aid groups in St. Louis, they can send a representative as a council that operates under this consensus model, where they can decide, without anybody being left out, how they can allocate excess resources from each individual group and put them to where they need to go. That can layer into a larger model for all of Missouri, and grow from there. So that's it in a nutshell.
So for those who are a part of a mutual aid group or want to be a part of a mutual aid group that might get involved in the network, where would you send someone?
Well, it would take, if somebody were to approach, then we'd ask them how or what projects interest them, where are they located, and we can find the best fit for it. If they were a mutual aid organization that was actively working, then we would just fit them into the structure.
Okay.
And
is there a website or anything like that?
that's in progress. We are also looking for people to help us do the background infrastructure of this project, because right now it's just two of us working on it as a part-time process for the along with all of the other things. So we definitely need more hands to help us get this off the ground.
All right, that's great to hear. I can certainly help with web design, copywriting, that kind of thing if you need it. And I did mention to a couple people at some point, or maybe it was yesterday when we were talking about this call. But for those who are on, if any of you want to form like smaller working groups, like to work on this, for example, we can certainly do that. I certainly don't even need to be a part of it. You can, but we should, like, we can start talking about that after the call on Signal. And then you guys can just run with it, because I'm definitely seeing some interest from others in the group, in the chat, to see this grow.
Yeah, I think that we're also not thinking outside the box enough on what makes up a mutual aid group. I think that 4 or 5 people who are really interested in web development can be a mutual aid group all on their own without an actual location. And that could be supportive of all the others, right? The same with internet security. You could have people who are really interested in internet security working together to benefit all of the other mutual aid work groups in the network. I think we need to expand our idea of what mutual aid groups can be to include remote work as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so I can't remember. I know your real name, and I know that for safety reasons you're not using it. So I'm just going to say Myco Mutual Aid. If you're ready to speak, let me know. And then when you're done, we'll open it up to questions.
I am ready. So I am Zoe Lovelace. I am starting up something called Myco Mutual. I am a software developer by trade. I am also an anarchist. The way I have decided to try to apply my skills to my beliefs is by building an online platform for mutual aid. What I'm looking to do is distributed. So I don't want this ultimately to be just one server sitting somewhere that's doing this. I want it to actually be kind of open source where people can spin up their own servers that run this. All the servers are going to talk to each other. But the idea behind it is that it will allow people to come in and either put in requests that they have, needs that they have, or things that they're willing to offer. I'm being very vague about that because I want it to be very flexible. I don't want it to be limited to any structured ideas of what might fit into mutual aid. I think mutual aid kind of goes far beyond, just, I don't know, just allowing people to put in whatever they need. So I need a ride to the doctor. I need a car repair. I need whatever. Conversely, I think people being able to go on and offer those kind of services. So not everybody is going to be able to commit to a mutual aid group necessarily. People in smaller towns, people in rural areas, that's not even going to be an option, but they still might be willing to contribute whatever they're able in their community. So if they are a mechanic, maybe they're willing to spend a weekend helping somebody out getting their car fixed. If there's a power outage somewhere and a grocery store has food rotting, they could go in and post, we have all this food, we don't know what to do. We could try to connect them with somebody who has a refrigerated truck to get that food to someplace where it does something more than rot. So that's my goal ultimately. This is still right now theoretical, but I'm trying to build it up. And so I think my interest in this will be making sure that we're kind of aware of people who are going to be outside of mutual aid groups, or needs that might fall outside of what mutual aid groups in their area might be providing, and kind of making sure that we're kind of conscious of that and not ruling them out just because they happen to be in a rural area. So however much I can do that on the Myco side, but also I think just kind of strategically, thinking that through and making sure that that's part of the planning process here too.
Awesome. Thank you. So, just for me, I really believe that there's so many connections here, among the things that the Socialist Rifle Association is doing with what Unbroken Circle is doing, and what, you, Zoe, are looking to achieve. A huge part of this being successful across a really large country with a lot of people would be digital access, like this network online, enabling the sharing of goods and services in the real world. So certainly anybody who has a technical background or wants to help in any other way, let's start those conversations on Signal, and we can put together a working group if there is interest. And for anyone who may be watching this recording, who wants to be put into the Signal, you can let me know. I'm at Awkward Rap on Twitter. I think that's it for me. We had planned on an hour and we do have 10 minutes. We can certainly go over too if you guys want. Does anyone have any questions you want to ask any of the speakers, or anything else that you want to bring up related to mutual aid?
I have a question. I'm from Orleans out here with a couple mutual aid groups, and I've been talking to people in the past about having a safer encrypted way for comrades across like the Turtle Island to be able to have some sort of system where we don't have to call the cops in case of an emergency. And so this kind of sounds like the first opportunity I've heard where something like that could happen. Can you speak on that? Have you thought of that?
Those who know me certainly know that fits right in with, my primary area of focus. It's certainly critical to the abolitionist framework that you don't just defund police and leave our current society in its current state without police, who, as most of us on this call probably understand, are not the ones keeping us safe or preventing crime today. The solution is, of course, to create groups that, or organizations or collectives that have the expertise to address mental health crises, for instance, or other reasons people may think they need to call the police today. And certainly it could fit within the mutual aid framework. It is the kind of thing where certain people who have that expertise could be a part of this network that, Myco Mutual is trying to put together. But I am not aware at this point of an existence of that nationally. There are groups in certain cities, some tied to the cities themselves. I mean, Portland is one of those places, but it's not necessarily free of their, I don't think that the majority of them currently provide the anonymous safety net, that a lot of us would probably like to see. So, you know, I don't know, that might be something that Faye also knows about. But, you know, I think that's a really important question. And, you know, these are definitely the kinds of people we would love to offer their services. Because right now, that's the biggest thing, is that people know that when they call the cops, they're essentially asking someone who's trigger happy with a gun to maybe make things worse, but they don't know what the alternative is.
I think it could also be useful for DRS in general. And like you said, this isn't reachable for rural cities just yet, or rural areas just yet. But I think that a lot of us are travelers as well and passing through cities. And if we have an accessible way to notify each other of moments where like cops should not get involved at all, period, I think that that's something I'd like to help with.
Awesome.
I've got a question, if that's okay.
Sure. I just wanted to add quickly too. You know, there's a lot of abolitionists who I'm connected with. You know, there's a couple I have in my head right now who probably know a lot more than I do also. So I can pose that question to them and get back to the group. If there's anything like that kind of in the works that I just may not be aware of. Go for it, Thomas.
Thanks. Something that came up when you and Sarah were talking kind of connects to what I wanted to add. I have some awareness of the history of the 60s and 70s. And one of the most important functions that's really underestimated, we've all heard the word teach in, but there was an education function and a curation function of that movement. The movement curated itself, and there were people who consciously took upon themselves the role of, let's educate people about what this is about. Let's just not let it be a mess, a melange of people doing stuff. And it occurs to me that mutual aid is a wonderful kind of umbrella concept for people to take on the, okay, now we've got these refugees coming in. Let's help them understand what they're part of. Let's help them understand and channel them into, these are things you can do that are positive. I'm also in Portland, and I know that from one remove, so maybe some people are closer to what's going on in Portland than I am, but there's people around here who just want to fuck things up. And there's people around here who want to really make something better, and there's everything in between. And it's not well, it's kind of a melange, and that melange can tip in any direction. And when you think about that happening nationally, if there really is the energy for disorganization of the status quo, you really want to be well organized about reorganizing the status quo at the same time. That was kind of the beauty of the Sanders campaign, that it wasn't just an against something, but a for something, whether you were for it or not. There was a kind of a collection around positive goals. And I'm thinking that the mutual aid people who are really into building mutual aid organizations might consider themselves as having two goals, not one. One being the aid itself, and another being the curation and the absorption of people into that into that movement, so that going forward they can themselves be the positive force for the next group. That's my point.
Yeah.
I have I have some things I can say about that
I was
within
going to
the
ask you
SRA.
exactly.
In the SRA, we have a few chapters have started a project called Red Bread. Specifically, our West Los Angeles chapter and our Minneapolis chapter, our Minnesota chapter, where it's essentially show up with a table with goods and supplies for if you're homeless or just economically, you know, in a bad place. It's a free store. Show up, take whatever you need. But there's also a table full of literature, full of political theory and pamphlets and zines. And I think that's a really good way to go about it. I think that having a sort of education and curation component to a mutual aid is actually very important. You just have to be careful about how you do it, because you don't want to seem like, you don't want to seem like a church. You don't want to seem like you're selling your ideology to someone, say, or worse still, making it seem like the aid is contingent upon accepting aspects of it. There needs to be that understood that there's no expectation of reciprocation or exchange. We are helping you with your material circumstance. Also, here are some books we think you should read if you want to.
Yeah, so the only thing that I have to add is, for myself, is people want to engage in the movement however they want to engage in the movement. And some people are ready to solidify and organize into a really in a really stable and solid manner for a long-term purpose. And a lot of people just aren't. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of people might not want to admit it, but the people who just want to fuck shit up are actually critical too. And because they get the attention is there, and that sort of thing is what gets the headlines and draws attention to the issues most. So we can't proselytize, right? We can say, this is why we need to do it. This is why we're doing it, but do it the way you want to. And hopefully they'll come around to more productive long-term projects. Maybe they won't.
I understand that. I'm talking about something that I think everybody else is talking about, which is a very slow, evolutionary, growing sort of thing that takes place over time. But there really, I think, does need to be a sense of direction, because if this kind of thing succeeds, you can't collapse something without having something to replace it, or you're just going to lose people. That's all. But I understand it's slow, and it does. This shouldn't be a preachy church. It should be just something that, nudges gently but consciously, nudges in a direction that produces positive results. That's all.
I think Not One More Block said it best. Burning down a police precinct got more done than any voting or BS legislation. I talk about this a lot. I don't think that the civil rights movement would have been successful without the threat of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party and all of the more radical groups that those who listened to MLK, who we know was also hated, they were more afraid of what the alternative might be. And the people who, as you put it, like, fuck shit up, those are not the same people who are going to city council meetings, and they're often not the same people who are doing mutual aid, but they're all important. And certainly cops, for instance, don't like mutual aid groups either. But if you're peacefully setting up a table with literature and goods and offering services, you're far less dangerous than those who are burning down the precinct. So, they're all critical. But I think, Thomas's point really is that including, it's like the teaching a man to fish thing. Like, you don't just give him the fish, you teach him how to do it. And so when you're doing mutual aid, getting recipients to be providers as well isn't not just like a great way to, it's not about proselytizing. It's not just a great way to expand your reach, but it empowers those individuals too.
This isn't the violent, nonviolent discussion that I'm trying to have. The Black Panthers were very political, and God bless them for that. This is the people who are trying to help the people who are angry and mindless to be mindful. This is not about how you go about it. It's about what you're trying to do and helping people to understand that okay, you're upset, but think about why you're upset and move forward with some thought. That's all. But it's not about violence versus nonviolence. That's not my point at all.
Right. And it goes back to what I started this with, which was a summary of what Sarah Nelson told us at our last call, that we need to understand what the problems are and what the ways are to fix those problems, and being thoughtful is important. Riggedy Rags, you have a question?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Rags, and I can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. I am. I'm just going to try to contain myself because, like, y'all are talking about everything that I've been dreaming about forever, and I'm having a hard time not just putting down the computer and going out in the backyard and start digging because I'm actually planting a 4th garden bed right now. So this year, last year, I started growing my own cannabis here in Oklahoma. We have medical cannabis legalized now, so we can all grow cannabis in our backyards to grow our own medicine. So that kind of springboarded me into my homesteading venture, and I actually stumbled upon this rental property that I'm in right now, where the landlord has given me permission to garden in the backyard. So I'm right now, what I'm doing is I'm germinating seeds, and I'm getting a late start on my garden to get a push for a little bit of mutual aid this fall, with a plan to actually have a really good plan to grow most of my food in my backyard, and then to use my excess for mutual aid next year, and to use that to do basically what Thomas was talking about, educate people on having a safety net to come back in on, and to collapse down on once anything else happens in the general strike, and to use mutual aid as a tool for education. So my question is, how can I best transition from working full-time for an income that has nothing to do with all of my personal passions, and transitioning that into getting this whole mutual aid and organization, public organizing? How can I switch that into being my full-time occupation? Because I have got to get my income lined up in some way with all this mutual aid stuff, or I'm just not going to have the energy to divide between having an income and doing the mutual aid stuff.
Man, I wish I could tell you, because I just had to give up trying to be a part of the rest of it in order to do it. And I think the answer to that would be a very long call on its own. But I'd be willing to personally help you try. So yeah, but I did tackle that myself, and I couldn't come up with a way without just saying, fuck it all.
So
Really.
Sarah says sell your weed, which wouldn't be a terrible idea.
Right.
The
And
only
it's-
way
it's-
that I've avoided a job for this whole pandemic is by just, getting on unemployment and focusing on some side hustles. Like gig working is really easy in New Orleans, but it's also easy everywhere if you're doing it actively.
Right. Well, another thing is that I'm dealing with a hip injury right now, so I'm actually on medical leave, and so looking for anything else is like I'm having to postpone it just for that.
Right.
But oh man, I lost my track. Whew.
Well, while you're thinking, you got it?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is something just worth considering. In the work that I do mostly, I've heard many times from incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people that one of the reasons that I can be trusted is because I don't earn anything from the work that I do. I do marketing and web design and writing and those kinds of things in order to earn a very modest income that allows me to put my passion into these other things that can never, be questioned for having some kind of selfish or, monetary motive. So while there are ways to do this, what you're suggesting, and I totally get the desire, it's just worth considering that one of the issues that is the case often with the formal, the nonprofit industrial complex is the percentage of money that goes to the people who are running them versus the actual services that they, ostensibly exist to provide.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to start this up, is like I'm just giving away my excess, and I'm working to produce more food than I can possibly eat, and then anything that's more than I can possibly eat goes to the mutual aid network, and then just share that that's what I'm doing. And hey, if you have a backyard garden, can you do this too? And can we link up? And can this be a whole thing around green country? Because like it could be like how y'all are talking about local mutual aid networks. I don't know of anything like a backyard garden network of people, because I know people that grow food in their backyards. And I know people that like they share with their neighbors and stuff, but do they actually link up to have a network to share it across a county or across a region and a state to
So,
people who wouldn't be linked in with that network?
I am aware of community gardens in various cities across the country where people, a group of people rent an empty plot of land, build a greenhouse or some raised beds, and they grow a bunch of food, and it is distributed as mutual aid, fresh produce to anyone who needs it. Or sometimes I'm aware of at least one city, I think it was in St. Louis, a community garden would deliver to low-income elderly people. So these sorts of things do exist at a local level. I'm not aware of any sort of national coordination among them. Um, yeah, it is the main issue that does occur with those is you typically have several people who are willing to fund them, but only a couple of people who are able and willing to do the gardening work itself. And so if one of those people is no longer able to work on it, then it becomes much more difficult to keep the project running.
Right.
We have
And
New Orleans too, and a conversation I was having recently was like if we're all coming from different eco regions, and if we are lacking one crop and have a conversation with a comrade who's going to be traveling south, I think it'd be really good to be able to transport some produce rather than using major conglomerates.
And what you're talking about is exactly the kind of thing that I'm trying to bridge with what I'm building, connecting people who otherwise would not be connected and aren't necessarily even in a mutual aid group. I'll say though, I don't think I mentioned before, I do expect it to be used by mutual aid groups. They'll probably be the first, hopefully, that will help me kind of drive how it works. But yeah, ultimately, I want it to be that individual level and being able to match people up that otherwise would not find each other.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking of you too. And for anyone who missed it or who's not on the call live, Zoe mentioned that we should have a follow-up call to like put together an actual action plan to get these different balls rolling. So after the call, for anybody who wants to help in any way, let's schedule that call, and the same goes for anyone who may be listening after the fact. Does anyone else have anything else?
I would just wanted to mention that Lee Carter, he lost his race. So what's in the cards next for him is he is trying to get a farm in Virginia and move there with his partner. And they've been inviting people to come join them. And he's, being a delegate in Virginia, knows a lot about how to get government subsidies for a large farm project, and he wants to make it fully sustainable and good for the environment. So just wanted to mention that maybe he's someone to loop into these conversations.
Do you think you could ask him, Zoya?
I talk more to his partner just because he's super busy. But yeah, I mean, if you guys are open to it.
Of course, yeah, definitely. Not one more block. You had a comment?
Yes, hi. Not one more block here from New York City. I just wanted to mention really quickly about worker cooperatives. I think in my opinion, they will be essential for us to transition out of this capitalist nightmare that we're currently in. And if y'all take a look at Cooperation Jackson, which is in Jackson, Mississippi. It's Black-led. They're doing great work. They're doing all of the mutual aid things like growing food, creating worker cooperatives, and there's a great book called Jackson Rising that the founder wrote that you can get, and it's a good read, and it really helps ground one into what worker cooperatives are. So that's what I wanted to mention.
Yeah, that's true. I'm gonna reach out to Equality for Flatbush as well as Cooperation Jackson and see if there's any interest. Anything else, or you want to just follow up on Signal and start planning for the next call?
I was gonna I have my hand raised in the on
Oh,
Zoom.
sorry.
I was gonna say that there's a driver-owned co-op here in New York City. I mean, I'm in New York City. They're very I would say politically active, so to speak, for lack of a better word. They actually do a lot of outreach to the community, which I think is important. They're actually organizing with us.
I lost you. I think you're on mute. There you go.
Oh yeah. There's some organizing here on March here as well in New York as well as across the country. So they've been very helpful in that regard. So yeah, there's tons of worker-owned co-ops, and I think that's really important for us to be more engaged with them as well.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Unless there's anything else, we'll take it to Signal and plan this next call.
How do I get on Signal?
What's that?
How do I get in on this Signal thing?
Let me put the link in the chat, and when I upload this recording, I'll share it there too. So we do have another call that we haven't started planning yet that we can maybe put on hold if people want, where we're going to talk more about learning from the history of strikes, striking workers, the labor movements, and general strikes. But I'm thinking, there's so much interest in the mutual aid side of things, and I think there's so much agreement as to the necessity of it for a variety of reasons, including enabling a general strike if necessary, that we should probably for now focus on that. And anyone who wants to even listen in or be a part of the action, let's start to organize that. Does that work for everyone?
Yes.
Sure.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers. We shared everyone's Twitters in the chat, but for those who are listening after the fact, I will post them as for you guys as well, along with Cooperation Jackson, Equality for Flatbush, Socialist RA, and everything else. I look forward to talking to you all again soon. And Faye is suggesting security culture, OPSEC, InfoSec. Yeah, that's all good stuff for certainly even for the working group where we're talking about building a digital infrastructure. That's got to be a part of it. We could possibly break that out into another call as well. But everyone have a great weekend. You know where to find me, and let's get planning on the next steps.
Yay.
All right. Bye, y'all.